Hi everyone, my name is Melanie Grant, and this is C&M Glass. Today we're covering topics for our ICD-10 PCS coding pertaining to the male and female reproductive systems, which are part of the surgical section for body systems V and U, as well as the obstetrical section, which is its own separate area, and codes to section 1 with body system 0 for deliveries. Some of our key points today, we're going to be talking about the male reproductive system and a brief review of some of the concepts we've discussed previously with the urinary system. We'll be looking at the female reproductive system and some of the specific guidelines, as well as some unique situations with approaches. And then really our big focus also will be looking at obstetrical and how to identify when you should be coding from the obstetrical section versus the female reproductive. So let's get started. The first thing we look at with chapter 18 on page 381 is that we have a couple of really great diagrams on the bottom of 381 and 382 showing us not only the male reproductive system and each of the different parts of the organs within it, but also separating those from our urinary system. The important thing to remember here is that whatever your procedure is for, the body area or system you're going to should be where you're coding with. So when you're comparing the male reproductive and the urinary system together, keep in mind that any procedure that goes through the urinary system to get to a male reproductive system organ or body part is in fact going to code to the male reproductive system, not the urinary. This is really important because sometimes new coders can get a little confused with that approach, but it's really no different than when we go through the skin to get to another organ through an open approach. So keep that in mind and you should be able to identify these just fine. For the purposes of covering some of our male reproductive system, we also look at some of the guidelines that were reviewed previously in the urinary system because they will apply in both cases. So I've pulled up some of those from our previous chapter, and on top of page 366, where we have some of the guidelines for the urinary system, which also happen to apply in the male. The first one we look at is B6.1c. Procedures to a device should code with a device root operation. So what this is saying is, and this applies really across the board in any circumstance, but you'll see it a lot more in male and female procedures, but you want to look at if a device is being coded, where is the device located? Is it located in the urethra or is it located somewhere within the male reproductive system? Once there is a device and if there's any changes to that device, it's simply saying use the root operations that are pertaining to devices specifically and not root operations that may be different. And they give an example here of listing those as change irrigation, removal revision, as some of the codes that you may encounter. Our next one on B311B is that multiple tubular body parts inspected will code to the furthest location. So what that's saying is, and this is a great way of identifying the difference between urinary and male, is that wherever you end up, the last or the most distal part of the body from where you started is where we're going to code for an inspection in a tubular body part. So if we go through the urethra and then down into the seminal vesicle and vas deferens, perhaps going into the epididymis or somewhere else within the testes, then you're going to code as the inspection to where you ended up, and that's going to fall within the male reproductive system, even if you may have started in the urinary. Likewise, if you don't go as far, if you stop within the urinary, then you're going to be coding a procedure in the urinary system and not the male reproductive. Our last one here for the male and urinary review is that B5.4 basically says any approach that's done through a device code as the approach of the device placement. So if you go through a device such as I think they give us a percutaneous device that was placed here. Example was a percutaneous nephrostomy. If you go through that device, then your approach is percutaneous, not endoscopic, because the device itself is holding open an already percutaneous procedure. And so you're still percutaneous in your approach. So those are our 3 guidelines from the urinary that I wanted to carry over into our male just as a quick review. Now, you do have some body part values that are listed on the bottom of 383. You'll notice there's not a lot of body parts within the male reproductive system. The main sex organ is actually considered to be the testes, and all of the other parts of the male reproductive system are considered accessory organs to that. You will notice that you have several different parts. So some procedures will give you bilateral options. Versus left and right. If a procedure is done bilaterally and the option is there, make sure you're coding for that. Whereas if you don't have an option for a bilateral procedure and you do something bilaterally, you would code both left and right, or 2 of the same code if a bilateral or laterality is not specified. So keep that in mind. Not a whole lot of devices, but you do have a couple of them on 384, as well as qualifiers, which are going to be listed more specifically to diagnostic procedures, and you have a couple of them identifying location of laterality for the epididymis or the vas deferens, which may be part of a qualifier if you're needing that. So keep in mind whenever you're doing like a bypass, then you want to remember you have to include the qualifier to identify in both your body part the to and from within that procedure. So those are going to be listed as the ones that you have an option for. Other than that, there's not a whole lot more here. Most of your approaches within the male reproductive system is going to be either percutaneous or endoscopic through a natural opening. You may have from time to time where you're going to have an open approach. So in that instance, pay attention to your documentation and your guidelines, but that will be it. So there's not a lot with male reproductive, so let's code one of these together, and then we'll jump into that female reproductive and obstetrics from here. Okay, so I'm going to look at case number 3. Which is on middle of page 386. We have a placement of a bilateral testicular prothesis following bilateral orchiectomy. There's no additional information here, so they're expecting us to be able to get everything from this. And so we want to look at what exactly are we doing? A placement of a bilateral testicular prosthesis. So if we remember that a prosthesis is replacing the actual testes, and it's following the bilateral orchiectomy, so the removal of the testes. Remember your guidelines. If the removal of a procedure or the removal of a body part is done during the same time that you're putting in a prosthetic device or other replacement device, then in that case you're going to have one code, not 2, because that includes the excision or resection of the original procedure. And so here, we should identify that our root operation would be replacement. And so we can get started. We know that we're in the medical and surgical section of the male system, and we're going to use replacement, which if you remember from your root operations is going to be character R. If I couldn't remember that, I could always go in and research in my index for the term replacement to find out where I'm going. So I'm going to start with table 0VR, and I'm flipping to that now. Okay, and I'm in ICD-10. I'm in a 2018 edition that's recommended for this class. ICD-10 PCS Expert Edition from the Optum 360. If you don't have that book, that's fine, but if you do, you can turn in with me over to page 639. And so I find my table for 0VR is a very small table. in the middle of two other tables on this page. Above it I have 0VQ, and below it I have 0VS, which tells me that I'm in the only section that I would be here. Now, you'll notice that there's only one option here, so there's not multiple parts of the table. I have male and surgical reproductive system, medical and surgical for male reproductive system replacement, and the options for my body part character are either testes right, testes left, or testes bilateral. And so if I look back at my term, I'll remember that it was bilateral, and so the character for my body part is C. The approach only gives the one option. And you'll notice they didn't really tell us in the documentation here. In an actual note, you should have more details and should be able to confirm the approach. However, according to this, there's only one way to do it. And so at this time, the approach would be 0 for open. Synthetic substitute and no qualifier. So this one was fairly easy because it doesn't give us a lot of differences in the details of what to select. So most of your male reproductive systems will be somewhat similar, where you have a couple of different areas and most of it will be guided. Do pay attention, just like you do in most areas, to other parts of the body system that may be different. I'm going to go ahead and stop this video, and then we'll come right back to our next video, which will cover the female reproductive and obstetrical section. Make sure you watch that, since we'll be going over some very important parts of the differences with female reproductive versus pregnancy and products of conception.